This is Modern Gaming Culture. This series will attempt to highlight the phenomenon of PC, console, and mobile gaming and bring to light all of its phenomenal aspects. Let's take a dive together into the world of modern gaming and take apart its structure. Now, here's your host, Rotimi Osagi. Alright, this is Modern Gaming Culture. This is episode 22, Modern Gaming Culture. This episode, I want to sort of introduce a new pace for the show. Because I want to really be able to kind of attempt to, at least, integrate a lot of the material I want to start formalizing into more palatable material, forms of uh, very attractive like charts and visual aids, etc. Um, so as to prepare people for a lot of material that we have in the pipeline, because um, a lot of this material is very heavy, and so for the sake of not letting it be a sledgehammer, right? Want to start to having a lot more formal material for it. The thing is though is that you know um, these things take resources, right? And so it's not something where you really want to you know prepare people for something that really there isn't infrastructure for. Yeah, right. Like for something as big as putting together Pantheon, right? Um, a storied franchise, right? Um, you know, it's not something where you would want to you know really put together, right? Without really having the support it needs to really flourish. So I want to turn this into definitely more effective of an educational outreach. And so, especially with sort of what I'm noticing with the zeitgeist, right? That people really are hungry, right, for this type of material, right? Um, Definitely want to, you know, even with the traffic not really where being where I want it to be, right? Especially the reach too, and the impact, of course. But especially when it comes to gaming culture, right? Um, so spontaneous, and so you can't necessarily get bogged down in the numbers, right? In the numbers game, and so something that you have to just power through, right? And let the chips fall where they may, right? Um, you know, Either way, I still want to just have this material being so valuable because I'm always going to preach that, if people really like my work and they really enjoy what I do, that they should start from the beginning, right? And even if that means going all the way back to, a lot of stuff I did, because again, I'm very unfamiliar. I'm not unfamiliar with internet publishing, right? And so, a lot of this material which I've done right? Um, Recently, right? Compared to, when I was doing internet publishing, right, from Jump, right? Um, you know, it's still, infinitely, you know, more valuable than, anything you'll find out there when it comes to anything related to gaming these days, right? And so, or esports as it's known colloquially, right? And so even though, you know, it's not necessarily material which I would, recommend particularly, right? When it comes to really diving in to the material that I present here, right? Is just that material is still so valuable, right? Um And so, and we're also filling a lot of holes when it comes to really what I'm talking about today on the show, right? And so, um, especially considering just how illiterate, technologically, right? Um, Society is when it comes to really coming up to speed with gaming culture, right? Which I refer to as, the greatest minds on earth, right? Refer to it as the most abject tyranny on planet Earth, right? Um, all sorts of colorful terms, right? And you know, still with how, pretty much, I would consider that like just kind of spiritual successors to the material which I've, attempted to dish out, meet out, right, a little bit at a time, right? um, on modern gaming culture, right? Um, you know, it's still very much valuable information, right? Um, so, I would consider it more like, I've got it, and, I really want to take the next step, type material compared to, the material that, I would do, right? And the material that, I plan on doing, right? On modern gaming culture, um, you know, um, in the near future, right? I've done some deck profile teasers, right? Um, Kind of also teased basically how I would do, more instructional style content with this production style, right? It's very much like self-produced production style that I'm trying to pioneer. Um, it's something where um, I want people to be really prepared to receive that, right? And so I think that just go back to the people I'm trying to reach, right? These are people where I understand that they don't necessarily need you know um, a firm hand, right? And they need more something like companionship, right? As opposed to a petty tyrant, for example, right? And so, in the interest of, reaching that audience, right? Still just trying to, maintain lighthearted composure, right? Um, so that, uh, the material's palatable, right? Um, with respect to the zeitgeist, right? Because, right, so that material, right, will be a lot more palatable, right? So, um, that's sort of the sentiment I want to move with, right? Um, Moving forward, right? So that you know, it's this material can be vindicated by history. You know what I mean? Because largely what you find with gamer culture, right? um, sort of as an aside, is that, when it comes to sort of pop culture, right? You have the pop culture icon, right? People who have played on a lot of these, professional teams, right? Um, for a lot of these team games, right? Like Defender of the Ancients, Dota, right? Um, Smite, League of Legends, right? Um, and then you have like your shooting sims, right? Rainbow Six Siege, Call of Duty, right? And again, this show is not, a esports variety show, right? Um, but nonetheless, right? Those are like just your archetypal pop culture icons, which have emerged in North America, right? Um, you know, in the internet. I mean, not the internet, the information era. Well, we're talking about more like the like third industrial revolution, or right. Um, with the advent of radio, right, the television, right. These are characters. It doesn't matter really when it comes to the history of, you know, um, these, icons. Meteoric rise to fame, right. You just have that archetypal pop culture icon, right. And so, um, whether or not, um, those characters are emerging right out of this you know um era of gaming, right. um which I refer to as modern gaming culture, right. Under that blanket term of modern gaming culture, right. um Despite um kind of how gaming has really been given the name of um essentially like this sort of um, kind of like an overnight celebrity, again, right? This term internet bullshit artist, right? Which have emerged from places like, South Park, right? Guys like, Trey Parker, Matt Stone, right? Um, you know, Whereas you have like your, traditional bullshit artists, right? Um, and now you have the internet bullshit artists, right? Nonetheless, pop culture icons, right? Um, and essentially, this facade that their notoriety, right, um, will really install, right, in the minds of people who immerse themselves in these games, right? Which I see no indication of, right, when I go on the server now these days, right? Like again, right, when a game like League of Legends, right, which is definitely like the most popular game in North America, right, um, beside Pokemon, right, um, you know, was coming up, right, you know, if you were going out, it's very easy to kind of extrapolate all this stuff, right? At least it is, back then, right? We're able to just go onto a server, right, and really understand where stuff is coming from. Right? It was very obvious and very simple, right? And so, when something, and then also, with algorithms back then, right, algorithms would store stuff based on popularity, right? Whereas algorithms now, are a lot more complex, right? That, a lot more stuff influences them, right? And also, essentially, an algorithm has a mind of its own, right? If you really understand the essence of an algorithm, right? And especially, when it comes to something so neutral, right? Like a computer program, right? So when you're really feeding it, a lot of garbage, right? It's basically what you're just gonna get out, right? It's not complex like you, right? And so, it's not something where, you can really even begin to make the assumption that you sort of understood where a lot of this stuff emerged from, right? And so, you can't necessarily just, when it comes to really trying to, try something out, whatever, right? Claim that, you really understand, oh, just because, you had an iPhone 12 when you were like 3 years old, right? Which is essentially what a lot of these, 16-year-olds that are, really, you know, um, becoming internet bullies these days, right? With respect to, what I refer to, as internet dark age, right? Which I consider the time that we be living in, right? You know, it's not something where, you can necessarily, bend, and it's just very simple thing to extrapolate, right? Again, right? People in, my generation, right? Generation Z, or, if, you have some very colorful way of interpreting, millennials, right? Um, Generation Z and millennials, right? Where we're just like, we've been part of the internet since the internet existed, right? And so nothing can get by us, right? When it comes to tricks, right? That, of things that seem insurmountable, right? Right? Like paywalls, for example, right? Um, and so it's like, these are things that you really just have to be discerning with, right? You know, again, right, in public schools, around here, right, we're taught, SMART goals, right? And it's an acronym, I forgot what it even stands for, right? Um, but the R, all I know is it stands for realistic, right? And then I know the T is like time bound or something like that, right? But you know, um, yeah, when it comes to stuff like really being able to, tap in to, that zeitgeist, right? Um, right? Where in sports is generally called being in your prime, right? You know, um, it's something where, again, right? It's just the, age old, um, I'm smarter than you, phase of being a child, right? And so, especially these days, right, with how bad it's gotten because of how little people really even have to get sucked in, right, because of just how powerful the technology is now, right? You know, having this sort of, you know, hubris while interfacing in general, whether it be, in person, right, or, online, right, is unacceptable. And that's really what has made it seem like somehow things are getting a lot better, right? At the rate that, it seems like things are getting a lot better, right? So, um, it's just something to keep in mind, right? Um, because again, right, with gamer culture, we have to really tread a line, right, between feeding and not feeding, right? And so um, maintaining that equilibrium, right, is not something that can really be fucked with, right? To use very strong language, and so, when you have a lot of these characters, right, especially, right, when you're talking about, a game like League of Legends, right, which is not necessarily, as I'll talk about, right, um, as important, right, as a game like Pokemon, right, which I'll get into, right. Um, just to introduce a couple, mainstay topics that I want to sort of, you know, pass around, right? The show, right? So I think we'll leave it there for more part of this episode. Um, and I think I'll just close it for this episode. So this has been Modern Gamer Culture. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you.